topic is the family trip to California to visit Aunt Margaret, Uncle Larry, and Cousin Bill. The trip was made in December 1956. We were a family of 7. The trip had been planned by Mom and Dad for years. They kept a California trip jar in the kitchen cabinet where every dime that came into their possession went into that jar. In 1956, Mom and Dad bought their very first new car, a 1956 Plymouth station wagon, aqua blue on the bottom and white on the top. It had 2 bench seats. At that point, there were no 3-seat station wagons, so the kids that were occupying the rear of the station wagon shared the room with some luggage and laid or sat on the floor of the rear deck. The station wagon was a 6-cylinder, 3-speed on the column for economy. Our family had not really traveled out of state very much, and the plan was to follow Route 66 from Chicago to LA. Larry and Margaret lived in Hemet, California, which was to the east of LA. The plan was a week out, a week back, and 2 weeks visiting. Dad had arranged his vacation over several years so that he had a 2 weeks vacation at the last of December 1956 and 2 weeks for the first 2 weeks in January 1957. To get permission from the school for those of us that were in school, we had to approach all the teachers that we had classes in and get their permission. Almost everyone had a requirement that they laid on us that something would have to be done either during or after the trip before their approval would be given. I know the band director, his requirement for Lynn and myself was that we would take our instruments along and practice our solos, which were to be presented at the Spring Music Festival, which was a competition amongst all the schools in our conference shortly after we returned. So I took my alto saxophone and Yvonne took her flute. I think I practiced once, which in my mind fulfilled the requirement that had been laid on me. Mr. Magno, not Spearschneider, whatever the Whitwer was the biology teacher. His requirement for me was that I would give a dissertation to the class upon my return about the trip. So various teachers had various things that they laid on us. Our family was not one that had traveled out of state very much, so we were somewhat neophytes as tourists. And So when we got to our first tourist type stop, it was Hannibal, Missouri, the home of Mark Twain. We decided to visit the Mark Twain home and museum. We pored over every item in that museum, reading every card on every display. Definitely we were attentive tourists. We were going to make everything of this opportunity that we had in front of us. As we motored on west, as the song says, there were three of us that were licensed drivers, Mom, Dad, and myself. I'd had my license for a year and a half. And Dad, being the nervous Nelly that he was, always sat directly behind me, and so he could watch the speedometer and have the driver's eye view so that he could coach me if the requirement came up. On top of the car was a Sears gray metal luggage rack with a gray canvas top. And because we had to utilize the back of the station wagon, as much luggage as possible was packed into the top. And of course that had to be unpacked every night and packed every morning. Also the straps that held it to the car were not very effective, and so Dad and I would have to go around and check and tighten the straps every time we stopped for fuel or lunch. It definitely was a budget job. Dad, being the nervous Nelly, had an ulcer, which we attributed to his nervousness about everything. But as it turned out, knowing what we know today, it's caused by a virus. But at that point, we thought that it was the nervousness. I know there were two issues that I caused a real eruption. He would also, when the ulcer bothered him, he would vomit. He couldn't keep any food down. I know there were two issues that happened on the trip out, which were insensitive on my part, but being young and insensitive, we caused him to worry, and it flared up the ulcer. The first time we were, I think, in Kansas City, and Bob and I decided to, before the family left from where the motel where we had stayed that night, to stretch our legs and walk around a bit. Well, this whole topic of wandering around a bit made Dad very nervous, and we didn't really explain what our intention was, so all he knew is that we were missing, and we had just decided to walk around a couple blocks, and there was hell to pay when we got back and helped load the car. The other issue was when we were out in Hemet, and Bob and I decided one afternoon to go climb the mountain that we could see to the north of us from Larry and Margaret's. The sense of distance was not very strong in us at that point, and we walked for several hours, and the afternoon was getting kind of long in the tooth at that point, and decided that we weren't even going to make it to the mountain, much less climb the mountain, and turned around and headed back. Well, it was just getting dark when we arrived back at Larry and Margaret's, and were strongly recommended that we not ever do anything like that again. And I felt bad that I had caused so much consternation. On our trip out, we stopped at the Painted Desert and the Petrified Forest. remember as often as we could, we would plan to stay at a relative or a friend's house to save us the cost of the motel. We stopped in Kansas to visit the Hikes, Ken and Elnora Hike and their family. I don't remember what city it was, but just before that or just after that, we stopped at a cousin's house, whose name I don't remember at this point, and we had all had dinner. Now, dropping 7 people into your house was rather overwhelming, I would imagine. So after dinner, we all sat around, kind of waiting for them to pop the question, and they were kind of waiting around for us to leave. And finally, Mom and Dad, through whatever signal system they had between them, decided that we weren't going to be invited to spend the night. And we thanked them and left, and there was then the struggle to find a motel. We had to have 2 rooms, a motel that had openings at whatever time that was, 9 o'clock at night, driving around in the dark. Obviously another opportunity for a flare-up of Dad's ulcers. We know we did go to several motels which had no space available, but we finally found one and camped for the night. Every time we saw a tourist type stop, we begged it to stop. So there was the giant ball of string. Scratch that. Painted desert, petrified forest. We did not go to the Grand Canyon. I think Joshua Tree Monument. When we were at Larry and Margaret's, Larry at that point was prospecting for uranium. He had arranged to be home most of the time that we were there, but he had a Jeep and a trailer and a donkey that he used as a pack mule, and he would head off into the desert for weeks at a time to prospect for uranium. Never was successful after many, many years of trying, but that was what his endeavor at that point. He was a very talented photographer. Margaret was working as the shift nurse, I believe, or supervising nurse in a local hospital. She had arranged for a lot of time off also, so she traveled with us to lots of different places. One of the things that she had arranged for was we had tickets to go to the TV show Truth or Consequences. And so we watched the broadcast. Of course, everything was live in those days, so it was at night. But we went to the television studio and watched the broadcast of Truth or Consequences. We also went to the Rose Bowl parade. I don't remember who played, but we had to be there. We left early in the morning while it was dark and it was cold, and took our little position on the curbing along the walkway. It was rather overwhelming to us, all the activity and the floats and all the work that had gone into creating all these beautiful floats out of flowers. Larry and Margaret's place in Hemet. Hemet at that point was kind of a dusty little crossroads. Larry's family had run a general store, and that's how they had come to live in the Hemet area. Their home was a modest bungalow-type home. There was a camping trailer on the property, that Yvonne and I think Bob and I had stayed in. That's where we slept. And I think the two younger girls stayed with Mom and Dad in the house with Margaret, Larry, and Bill. There were a number of walnut trees, mature walnut trees on the property, and so anytime there was time, we would be cracking walnuts, and obviously the skill was to crack the walnut and have two perfect halves, because the money that Margaret could sell the halves for was considerably more than the broken halves. So we tried to hone our skill cracking walnuts, so we spent hours, a little time each day, all of us that were capable, helping Margaret crack walnuts that could be sold for extra money. Larry's job obviously did not bring any money into the household, so she was always strapped for cash. The area surrounding their house was an olive grove, and I loved olives, Bob loved olives, and so at the earliest opportunity we climbed the fence into the olive grove, picked an olive, and started chewing on it, and were greatly surprised that olives that hadn't been processed did not taste like olives. It was an awful taste. One memory that I have of Kathleen at that point is her favorite activity was removing her shoestrings from her shoes. So anytime she was bored, she would untie her shoes and remove the shoestrings. So it fell to each of us to help out by reinstalling the shoestrings and putting Kathleen's shoes back on.